which is better, Crossfire or ExpressLRS, and why is one system better than the other? I see this question come up on Facebook quite a bit. And the problem with that question is, okay, yes, all the fanboys get in and pour their hearts and souls out as to why their chosen system is the best and why the other option is absolute garbage. But it really fails to take into consideration, I think, something that is more important than which system is objectively best, because every pilot's really different. Everyone has a different fleet, and no system is objectively better than the other, because they all have their pros, they all have their cons. And the real question is, which system is right for you based upon your particular situation? I'm going to share with you why I choose to fly ExpressLRS over any of the other radio systems out there. And I've flown all of those systems and had those systems as my daily driver or my primary system at one point or another in my FPV journey. So I do feel like I'm qualified to tell you about it, just like I'm qualified to tell you about our sponsor, AliExpress. AliExpress is an online marketplace that allows you to buy practically anything, mainly shipping from China, but also Taiwan, Singapore, and a few of the other Asian countries as well. And when my local FPV is out of stock and it doesn't look like they're going to get it really soon, I turn to AliExpress. You can even find name brand products from Foxeer, Diatone, Speedy Bee, Runcam, and iFlight, as well as Radio Master, just to name a few. There are affiliate links in the description to all my favorite FPV products that you can buy from AliExpress. Now, the first thing we need to understand when comparing ExpressLRS to Crossfire is what is the main difference between the two systems. And the real difference is, think of Crossfire like an iPhone and ExpressLRS like Android. Only TBS make and sell Crossfire products, whilst any manufacturer can make and sell ExpressLRS, kind of like how anyone can make and sell an Android phone. Now, there are a whole bunch of pros and cons to open source versus closed source, and we're not going to argue about those today. But one thing that open source does do is give you the freedom to choose from which manufacturer you prefer to buy from. And it also means that there's more competition, so if more companies are selling the one product, such as a receiver or a transmitter module, that in a sense can either create differentiation, where one company might use more premium and high quality parts, whilst it also provides competition, keeping prices fair and reasonable. And that leads me to the next point, being the cost difference between ExpressLRS and Crossfire. I use the Radio Master receivers, which come in at $19 each, whilst a Crossfire Nano receiver with an Immortal T antenna, that comes in at $30. So there's an $11 saving per receiver. And you might be thinking, okay, it's $10, but that adds up. My current fleet is comprised of 11 quads, so that's $110 if you think about that across all those 11 quads. But it's not just in receivers, it's also in the transmitter module. A Radio Master Ranger micro transmitter costs you $40, whilst a TBS micro transmitter costs you $70. So there's a $30 saving there as well. And these costs do add up, especially in current economic times. And if you think about what your fleet is, it's going to add up, and that money can be used in other areas like buying more drones, buying batteries, or buying more props, because those things break. Now that leads us to the next point. What about compatibility? Well, all these different systems, they're all compatible with pretty much any drone. And that's true, but it does also come with some constraints. You see, with Crossfire, you've got the Immortal T antenna, which is going to give you the best performance, and that's kind of big. So if you're flying a 5-inch drone, it really doesn't matter. But when you start to fly micros, nanos, whoops, or racing drones, well, then it really starts to get in the way. Because sure, on a micro or a nano or a whoop, you can use a mini Immortal T, and what that's going to do is that's going to give you some performance issues. Well, it's not going to perform as good as a full-size Immortal T, so there is going to be a limitation. And you might be thinking, okay, well, with ExpressLRS, you can use the mini T antennas and get your full performance. And a lot of my 3.5-inch quads, I use that mini T and don't have any issues with performance. But with ExpressLRS, you can use a smaller antenna than the mini T. You can use a SMD or ceramic antenna, which is built onto the receiver. And they're great because it saves weight and saves having to fandangle a antenna onto a build. But the other really cool thing about ExpressLRS is a lot of manufacturers are phasing out using FreeSky on their whoops and micros and the all-in-one flight controllers and are moving to ExpressLRS with those SMD antennas. So you're not having a weight penalty of having to have an external receiver on a quad of 30 or 40 grams. And the extra 2 to 3 grams that a receiver and antenna adds is actually going to be a lot. But this leads us into choice. Now, like I said, open source versus closed source are a range of different manufacturers that produce different hardware. And yeah, that's important. But having more products to choose from is really beneficial, because let's say you wanted to get Crossfire and you wanted to get a radio that had internal Crossfire because you didn't want to buy an external module. Well, there's good news. You've got the choice of the Tango 2, the Tango 2, or the Tango 2. But the Tango 2 is a gamepad style radio. What if you wanted a, more normal or box size radio controller? Well, TBS also make another radio called the Mambo. Problem is that only runs tracer. So you're actually kind of stuck with having to then choose a radio, which you can choose any one that you want, and plug in a module. So it adds an additional cost to the radio. Again, going back to cost, right? With ExpressLRS, there's a range of different gamepad radios that you can choose from that have built-in ExpressLRS across different price brackets. You've got, for example, the Jumper T Lite, the Jumper T Pro, the I Fly Commando 8, as well as the Radio Master Zorro that all come in as gamepad style radios with built-in ExpressLRS. In terms of your full-size radios, you've got the Radio Master TX16S, as well as the Radio Master Boxer. They've all got internal ExpressLRS. Now, what if you still wanted to fly Crossfire and you wanted to buy your own radio? Well, you can just put in a module. The same way you could put on an ExpressLRS module onto any of those radios as well. So you might be thinking, well, at least you could buy a radio with internal ExpressLRS, since you're going to have to buy a Crossfire module anyway. Put the Crossfire module on the back and you're going to get the best of both worlds. But then when it comes to range and penetration, the obvious answer sounds like Crossfire, because after all, Crossfire runs at 900 MHz, while ExpressLRS runs at 2.4 GHz. And you'd kind of be right, because the physics of running at 900 MHz is very different to running at 2.4 GHz. Let me explain. Now, think of this, right? You're sitting in a room and someone in the next room is listening to music or watching a movie. Quite often, you're going to hear the bass travel through the wall of the sound they're listening to, whereas you may not hear the mid-tones or the treble tones from that movie or music. You're just going to hear the bass. And that's because lower frequencies do travel better through walls and hard objects. So that makes a lot of sense when you're flying through a bando. You want to have the best range and penetration, right? Because you want that signal to get through all of those physical hard objects like brick walls and metal beams that are in your way. But why does FreeSky at 2.4 GHz suck, but ExpressLRS doesn't? Well, this comes down to something called modulation. And this is basically how the different radio transmitter and receiver talk to each other. It's basically how they use their voice to communicate. Crossfire uses what's called frequency shift keying. And think of that as kind of like a piano. You see, Crossfire at 900 MHz will be playing the bass notes, and it might play a C2 for a 0 and a C2 sharp for a 1. So all the different signals are transmitted, and basically all it's doing is shifting between a low note and a slightly higher note, and it's sending the signal at the same volume. And because it's a low signal, it's able to get through all the obstacles in between it. But what about FreeSky? How does that work, and why is it horrible in these situations? Well, it uses amplitude shift keying. And what that means is FreeSky is just changing the volume of the note. So it might be playing it. So FreeSky uses the same note, right? Let's say it's C4 as an example. It plays C4 to signify a low at a softer sound, at a lower volume. But it'll play a 1 at a higher volume. So what's happening is you're in a situation where not only does a higher note, a higher frequency of note, have a harder time getting through those obstacles, but the smaller, the zeros are being sent at a lower volume, and the ones are being sent at a normal volume because the amplitude is shifting. And what that ends up meaning is that the receiver is only getting half the message. So it fail-safes, and it sucks, because only the louder messages are getting through. But what does ExpressLRS do? Because ExpressLRS has comparable range and penetration to Crossfire at the same frequency as FreeSky. Well, it uses what's called chirp spread spectrum. And that's kind of like a bird's chirping, which is why it's named chirp spread spectrum. But unlike Crossfire and FreeSky, which is using a piano, ExpressLRS is using a guitar, but it is playing the same note as FreeSky. When that note is played on ExpressLRS, it's sent at the same volume, so that's going to get through. But using chirp spread spectrum, what it does is it changes the pitch of the note depending as to whether it's a 0 or a 1. So the same note with a lower pitch is going to be a 0. That same note with a slightly higher pitch, which blends into that higher pitch, is going to be a 1. So by using chirp spread spectrum, it's able to penetrate at a higher frequency through those objects. The same way a bird's chirp is able to penetrate through a wall with the same effectiveness as a lower frequency note. So it's actually kind of remarkable technology in a sense. But you might be thinking, well, hang on a tick. What about the just pure physics of it? 900 megahertz is going to have way better penetration than 2.4 gigahertz because physics say lower frequencies versus higher frequencies will penetrate further. And you're right. And that's where ExpressLRS also has a 900 megahertz capability. You can buy dedicated ExpressLRS hardware on that 900 megahertz frequency, and you're going to get all the benefits of Crossfire at 900 megahertz with all the benefits of ExpressLRS being its chirp spread spectrum at that 900 megahertz. So it's kind of like imagining a bird chirping at a low frequency and being able to get through from a range and penetration perspective. But you might be thinking, okay, but why does everyone still fly 2.4 gigahertz if technically speaking, ExpressLRS 900 megahertz would be the better choice? Well, it's not, because 900 megahertz has some hard technical limitations. For example, it can only carry so much data and it can only transmit at a certain frequency. To think about it in another simple way that we can understand, imagine we're playing a first-person shooter game, right? So we're going to play online against friends, and this first-person shooter game is basically symbolic of flying a quad. Now, do you want to be using the original iPhone with its GPRS or 2G internet to be able to play that first-person shooter game? Or would you be rather using a Samsung Galaxy S20, for example, using a 4G LTE network with faster speeds because it can transmit faster and it can also carry more data? And because 2.4 gigahertz can not only transmit at a faster rate, but can carry more data, so what that means is we can actually have more pilots in the air because more data can be carried over that frequency. Hence why 2.4 gigahertz tends to be the preferred one, because the other aspect is you don't have to fly at a 1000 hertz packet rate all the time. If you want to increase your range and penetration, you can lower your packet rate from 1000 to 500 down to 50 hertz to increase that range and penetration. So you end up getting the best of the high speed performance with the best of the low speed range and penetration, giving you the, theoretically the best all-round system. And you might be thinking, okay, well, since ExpressLRS at 2.4 gigahertz gives you the best all-round solution, well, why doesn't TBS just make Crossfire at 2.4 gigahertz? Well, they do. It's called Tracer. The problem is the uptake of Tracer has been a lot less significant than Crossfire. There are no bind and flies, to my knowledge, that come with TBS Tracer as an option. They either come with Crossfire or ExpressLRS. So, okay, let's say you went down the path of, I still want to buy a bind and fly, but I want that with Tracer. Well, what you'd actually need to do is buy a plug and play and then put TBS Tracer into it. So you'd end up having to solder that in. You might be thinking, okay, well, doesn't it make it difficult? Yes, and this is where we get into the ease of use. So Crossfire works pretty straightforward. As long as you don't want to update it and you don't want to change anything in the future, you know, it's pretty simple, kind of like an Apple, it works. Whereas for ExpressLRS, there is a little bit of configuration required, which as each release of ExpressLRS has come out, that configuration's got even easier. The one thing I love about ExpressLRS is the binding phrase. So I've got a couple of different radios, and I've also, as I've mentioned, got a fleet of 10 quads. So I got the Radio Master Boxer the other day for a review and to do a tutorial on, and all I had to do was spend 5 minutes and flash my configuration to it, which was really simple. You can watch that video on my channel. And now all of a sudden, that is bound to all 10 of my quads. So I don't have to go through and individually bind them. And okay, yes, it's a little bit unique that I perhaps may use multiple radios, but the binding phrase just makes it really simple. When I get a new quad, I flash it with my configuration of ExpressLRS, and we're good to go. And it's already bound to my radio. I don't have to go in and bind it and do all of that. I just find it to be a lot easier. And I know people say, oh, flashing is really difficult. You can still use traditional binding as well. So there's nothing stopping you from doing that. But I do think from the long-term perspective, that little bit of difficulty of flashing a receiver or flashing a transmitter is going to give you a long-term benefit and just make using ExpressLRS a lot easier to use. And I make a lot of tutorials on how to do ExpressLRS. So if ExpressLRS is your thing, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, and then go watch any of my tutorials on how to do it. And feel free to drop a comment either in this video or in any of my other videos if you need questions or need help, because I do reply to the comments, especially if you are looking for help, where I'll do my best to get you bound and get you flying. Now, if you're trying to decide between ExpressLRS or Crossfire, you're probably looking at trying to buy a radio. So watch this video here for my buyer's guide on how to choose an FPV radio. I'm Darren Allett. Until next time, don't forget to send it.